There is a small sticker on the door of nearly every bank in America. A few letters, a quiet promise about your money, so ordinary you have walked past it 1,000 times without reading the words. You trust it completely, and you are right to. But in the winter of 1933, almost everyone who understood how banks actually worked believed that promise was a bad idea. Not a risky idea, a discredited one. It was opposed by the president who signed it and by the senator whose own name sits on the act that created it. The promise is deposit insurance, and the agency behind it is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Today it feels like bedrock, as permanent as the currency itself. The money you deposit on a Friday is still there on Monday, and it stays there whether your bank thrives or fails, whether the man who runs it is careful or a fool. For most of American history, that was not true. If your bank failed, your money was gone, not delayed, not reduced, gone, the way a letter thrown into a fire is gone. So the usual way of telling this story, the one that asks why it took the country so long to protect ordinary savers, misses the far stranger truth. The better questions are three. Why did American banks collapse at rates that no comparable country came close to matching? Why had every earlier attempt to insure deposits already failed, not once but 8 separate times? And why did the version that finally worked arrive over the loud objections of the very men who built it? Answer those, and the real shape of it appears, which is that the institution guarding your savings was born almost by accident, out of a fight that nobody entirely won. To understand why American banks failed, you have to start with a choice the country made long before the Great Depression, a choice so deep in the national character that hardly anyone thought of it as a choice at all. America decided to have thousands of small banks instead of a few large ones. This grew out of an old and genuine fear, older than the Republic in some ways, the fear of concentrated financial power. Twice in the early years the country had chartered a great national bank, and twice it had killed it, the second time in a famous political war that ended with the charter dead and the money scattered back out to the states and the towns. A single mighty bank with branches in every county looked, to generations of American farmers and legislators, like a threat to liberty itself, a way for money in the East to rule the lives of people in the West. So the law was written to prevent it. By 1920, branch banking was prohibited outright in 18 states and hemmed in by tight restrictions across most of the others. Even the federal government joined in. The McFadden Act of 1927 still forbade national banks from opening branches across state lines, locking each one inside the borders of a single state. The result was a banking landscape unlike any other on earth. At its peak, around 1920, the United States held roughly 30,000 banks, nearly one for every town with a main street and a grain elevator. Most of them were single office operations, one building, one vault, one small set of officers who knew every borrower by name and every family in the county. It sounds charming, and in good years it was, but it meant that the fortune of each little bank was chained to the fortune of one local economy, and often to a single crop. When the wheat failed, the bank that had lent to the wheat farmers failed alongside it. There was no branch in another state to lean on, no loans out to another industry, nothing to spread the risk across. This, and not bad luck or bad character, is the reason American banks failed constantly. The fragility was drawn right into the blueprint. If you want proof that this was a design and not a destiny, you only have to look north. Canada shared the same continent, the same frontier, the same dependence on farming and raw resources, the same brutal decade of the 1930s. But Canada had made the opposite choice. It let banks branch across the entire country, and so it grew perhaps 10 large banks, each with offices scattered from the Atlantic to the Pacific, each holding loans across many regions and many trades at once. During the Great Depression, the years that erased thousands of American banks and the savings inside them, the number of Canadian banks that failed was 0. Not one. A bank on the prairie could lose a fortune on collapsing wheat prices and still stand upright, because the same bank was earning money in Ontario and along the coast. The shock that killed an American town bank was absorbed somewhere else in the network by a Canadian one. In fact, Canada found the danger of bank collapse so remote that it did not trouble to create federal deposit insurance until 1967, more than 3 decades after the United States and long after any Canadian bank had failed. American bank fragility, it turns out, was never fate. The country had chosen it, and it kept on choosing it. There is one more piece you need before the tragedy makes sense, and it concerns the nature of banking itself, which is stranger than it looks. When you deposit money, you picture it sitting in the vault, your money waiting for you. It is not. A bank keeps only a fraction of its deposits as cash on hand. The rest goes straight out the door as loans to the farmer buying seed, the young couple buying a house, the merchant enlarging a store. There is nothing crooked in this. It is how banking has worked for centuries, and it is how a bank turns idle savings into a living economy. But it carries a permanent vulnerability. If every depositor asks for their money on the same morning, the cash is not there, because the cash is out in the fields and the houses and the shops. A bank can be entirely sound, its loans good, its books honest, and still be destroyed in a single afternoon by nothing more than fear, by a rumor that sends a crowd hurrying to the doors. Now set that vulnerability inside the American system of thousands of tiny, undiversified banks, and you can see how the fragmentation multiplied it. A one-town bank died with its one town, and there was no larger institution standing behind it to catch the fall. Here's the part of the story that almost never gets told, the piece that makes everything afterwards so surprising. The idea of insuring deposits was not new in 1933. America had already tried it, and America had already watched it fail. The Panic of 1907 had been a national humiliation. Runs swept the country, banks toppled in clusters, and the crisis was halted not by any government, but by a private financier calling other financiers into a room and twisting arms until the money moved. A nation did not like being rescued by one old man's telephone. In the wake of it, several states decided to solve the problem for themselves rather than wait on Washington. Between 1908 and 1917, 8 of them built compulsory deposit guarantee funds, pools of money that every bank paid into, so that if one bank failed, its depositors could still be made whole from the pool. Oklahoma went first, its law taking effect on the 14th of February 1908. Then came Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, Mississippi, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Washington. The arrangements varied. In most of the states, a depositor at a failed bank got cash from the fund fairly promptly. In Kansas and in Mississippi, though, what you received was a certificate, a paper promise to be paid later out of whatever the dead bank's assets eventually fetched, with the fund making up the difference in the end. For a while, the whole experiment looked like a triumph. Oklahoma boasted that within its borders, not one depositor had lost a single penny. Until it didn't hold. The design carried a flaw that would prove fatal, and it is worth understanding closely because it is the same flaw that would shadow the whole idea for the next century. The premium a bank paid into the fund had nothing to do with how recklessly that bank lent. A cautious banker and a reckless gambler paid exactly the same rate, and that flat rate made the insurance perverse. It took money from the careful banks and used it to cover the losses of the wild ones, which meant it quietly rewarded recklessness. Scholars who later combed the state records found the fingerprints of this in the numbers. Failures caused by panic and rumor did fall in these states, just as the reformers had hoped. But failures caused by mismanagement rose, because a bank shielded from consequences has less reason to behave. Set the columns side by side, and the failure rates ran higher in the states that had deposit insurance than in the states that did not. And each of these funds died the same way, with a sudden spike in failures in its final year that swamped the pool and finished it. Then came the blow that finished all of them together. After the First World War, farm prices collapsed, and the agricultural depression of the 1920s rolled straight across the farm states that had built these funds. Banks failed in waves, far faster than the pools could ever pay out, and one by one the funds drained dry and stopped protecting anyone at all. Oklahoma's, the proud first, could no longer cover its depositors by the early 1920s, and the law behind it was repealed. By 1930, not one of the 8 funds was still operating. Every last one had collapsed. So on the eve of the New Deal, among the bankers and economists who studied such things, the verdict on deposit insurance was settled and grim. It had been tried. It had failed. What remained was a discredited relic, the sort of populist scheme that sounded generous and ended in ruin. Which brings us to the 1920s in America, a decade we remember as prosperous, and which was, for the banking system, a long, slow bleed. Through those supposedly golden years, more than 5,000 American banks failed. Over 80% of them were small rural unit banks, the one-town, one-crop institutions, dying in places far from Wall Street. And the financial establishment, the great city banks and the men who spoke for them, largely shrugged. Those failures were treated as the natural pruning of a free market. the weak being weeded out, nothing to alarm a sensible person in a tall building in New York. Then the pruning became a firestorm. In December of 1930, a large institution in New York City with a grand and misleading name, the Bank of United States, went under after a run on one of its branches, and suddenly the failures were no longer confined to distant farm towns. They had reached the city, and the run that started it was set off, by most accounts, by nothing sturdier than a false rumor spread by a single disgruntled shareholder. Beginning that year, the country was hit by wave after wave of banking panic. 4 of them in all, each worse than the one before, rolling through 1931, 1932, and into the terrible spring of 1933. Washington did try to stop it. A new federal lender, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, poured hundreds of millions of dollars into thousands of struggling banks to hold them open. It was not enough, and the tide kept rising. When the flood finally crested, roughly 9,000 banks were gone. The deposits that vanished with them came to more than $1.3 billion, close to a fifth of every dollar Americans had entrusted to the banks that failed. Behind that figure were millions of ordinary families who had done nothing wrong, who had saved carefully for years and watched it evaporate behind a locked door with a handwritten notice taped to the glass. By the first days of March 1933, the machine had seized up completely. Governor after governor was declaring emergency bank holidays, ordering the banks in their states to shut their doors before the panic could empty them. Within 2 days of taking office, Roosevelt extended the idea to the whole country and closed every bank in the United States by proclamation, and Congress passed an emergency banking law within the week that let sound banks reopen only once inspectors had certified them fit. None of this was bad luck. It was the unit banking design, the fragmentation the country had chosen a full century earlier, finally failing all at once at national scale. Here is where the story turns against everything you might expect. The reform we now treat as sacred, the guarantee standing behind your savings, was opposed by very nearly everyone in a position of power. It did not arrive because the wise men in charge finally saw the light. It arrived almost in spite of them. Consider the president. Franklin Roosevelt, who would sign deposit insurance into law and take a good deal of the credit for it ever after, did not want it. Campaigning in 1932, he set down exactly why in a letter. Deposit insurance, he warned, would lead to laxity in bank management and carelessness on the part of both banker and depositor, and it would be an impossible drain on the federal treasury. He was not posturing for the newspapers. As the banking bill moved through Congress the following year, Roosevelt threatened to veto the whole measure if the insurance provisions stayed in it, and the men writing the bill, knowing full well the measure would die without that provision, called his bluff and left it in anyway. Consider the senator. Carter Glass of Virginia, the man whose name is stamped on the act, was a serious student of banking who cared about a very different reform, the separating of ordinary deposit banking from the risky business of trading in securities. Toward deposit insurance, he was cool and skeptical, seeing in it the same populist danger the experts had always seen. Consider the industry. The American Bankers Association and the great Wall Street houses fought the guarantee hard, and their argument was not a foolish one. They called it a subsidy for bad banks, a rule that would force sound institutions to pay for the sins of reckless ones, which was precisely what the failed state funds had in fact done. If this kind of history is worth your time, the slow machinery of how the country you live in came to be built, take a moment to subscribe before we reach the one man who truly wanted this guarantee. It helps this channel more than you would think. So who wanted it? Almost alone among the men who held power stood a representative from the wiregrass country of southeastern Alabama, Henry Stegall, the chairman of the House Banking Committee. Stegall had championed deposit insurance for more than a decade, and he championed it for a plain and honest reason. He was defending the small rural unit banks of his district and of states like it, the very banks the reformers believed ought to be allowed to die and be replaced by branches. Deposit insurance would let those banks survive. Deposit insurance had one force stronger than any senator on its side, and that was the public. Ordinary Americans, having just watched their savings disappear, wanted a guarantee, and they wanted it badly. Their anger had been fed all through that year by a series of Senate hearings in which a relentless prosecutor named Ferdinand Pecora put the country's most respected bankers on the stand and exposed how carelessly, and in some cases how corruptly, they had handled other people's money. The men in the tall buildings came out of those hearings looking less like guardians and more like gamblers, and the public mood hardened into something Congress could not ignore. And so the guarantee did not enter American law on its own merits, argued and won by its believers. It entered as a bargain struck between two stubborn men and pushed from behind by a furious electorate. Stiegel got his deposit insurance, and in exchange Glass got his wall between commercial and investment banking. The two halves fused together into the Banking Act of 1933, the law we still call Glass. Stiegel signed on the 16th of June. The institution now standing behind your money became law over the stated objections of the president and the senator whose names it carries. On the first day of 1934, the new Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation opened its doors, a temporary plan at first, insuring each depositor up to $2,500 and standing behind some $11 billion of the nation's deposits from the moment it began. And now the deepest puzzle of all. 8 state versions of this exact idea had been tried, and all 8 had collapsed in ruin. The experts had not been wrong about that history. So why did the 9th attempt, the federal one, not only survive but succeed beyond anything its own authors had dared to imagine? That answer lies in the differences, and they deserve naming precisely, because they are the reason your money is safe today. The state funds had insured banks inside a single state, which meant that when that one state's farm economy failed, every bank in the pool tended to fail together, and the fund had no healthy region left to draw on. The federal fund pooled the risk across the entire nation. A drought on the plains no longer had to drown the whole system because the same insurance was backed by thriving banks in cities and factory towns 1,000 miles away, unaffected by the dust. The state funds had charged every bank the same flat rate and looked away. The federal system paired the insurance with federal examination, inspectors who opened the books, and with the authority to step in and close a failing bank before it swelled into a catastrophe. National scale and real supervision, the two things those old funds had lacked, were exactly what made the new one hold. There was also the matter of who got to reopen. The new system did not just throw the doors back open and hope. Before insurance began, examiners went through the banks and sorted them, and the weakest were not allowed back into business to fail all over again on the public's dime. The same federal lender that had tried to prop banks up during the crisis now spent the following years buying ownership stakes in the survivors, injecting fresh capital to rebuild the cushion that the Depression had ground away. The banks that carried the insurance label were, on the whole, stronger banks to begin with, cleaned and shored up before the guarantee was ever stamped on the door. And there was a third thing, harder to measure but just as real, which was confidence. Days after taking office, Roosevelt had spoken to the country by radio, in the first of the talks that would be remembered as the fireside chats, and told frightened Americans plainly that the bank's reopening the next morning would be safe. When deposit insurance followed, it turned that reassurance into a standing promise a family could rely on. The result came almost at once, and it was startling. In 1933, around 4,000 banks had failed. In 1934, the first full year of federal deposit insurance, the number of insured banks that failed was 9, from 4,000 down to 9 in the space of a single year. And the bank run, that fixture of American life for a full century, the anxious crowd at the doors, the shoving in the street, essentially vanished from the landscape. The mechanism is almost embarrassingly plain. A depositor whose money is guaranteed has no reason to race anyone to the teller's window. If the money is safe either way, there is nothing to run from, and so the runs stopped, because the fear that had always fed them no longer had anywhere to go. It would be easy to end there, on the triumph, and a good many tellings do exactly that. But this channel keeps an honest ledger, and the ledger has 2 columns. On one side, the achievement is hard to overstate and simple to state. From 1934 to this very day, no depositor has ever lost a single penny of insured money in an American bank. The panic-driven run, which had wrecked families and toppled perfectly sound institutions since the founding of the country, was retired as a threat to the ordinary saver. That is a genuine and durable good, bought remarkably cheaply, and it changed the daily texture of American life in ways we no longer even notice. On the other side of the ledger sits the cost, and it is the cost the skeptics of 1933 half saw coming, which is what makes it so haunting to read their warnings now. Roosevelt had predicted that a guarantee would breed carelessness in bankers and depositors alike. He was describing, decades early, what economists would later name moral hazard, and he was right that it would come. Once your deposits are guaranteed, you no longer have any reason to ask whether your bank is prudent or reckless, and so you stop asking. The quiet discipline that watchful depositors had once imposed on their banks dissolved. You can watch the consequence arrive twice over. In the 1980s, the savings and loan institutions, A whole class of neighborhood lenders whose deposits were federally insured were turned loose by a wave of deregulation to chase risky real estate and high-yield bonds. Their managers gambled with what was, in effect, house money, since the depositors were covered no matter how the bets landed. More than 1,000 of those institutions failed. Their own insurance fund went bankrupt and had to be folded into the federal system, and the bill for cleaning up the wreckage landed on the taxpayer, well over $100 billion of it. Then, in 2008, the same logic wearing a far larger suit, the emergency rescues of banks judged too big to be allowed to fail. The losses socialized once again because every alternative on the table looked worse. Each time the insured were shielded. The reckless were spared the full weight of their recklessness, and the public picked up the tab exactly as an old campaigning politician had feared it would. And there is a subtler cost, smaller in the headlines and in some ways sadder. By making the fragile unit banking system survivable, deposit insurance removed the very pressure that might have forced America to fix the flaw underneath. Insurance and branch banking had always been rival cures for the same disease. One would have let the tiny, undiversified banks merge into large, diversified networks the safe Canadian shape. The other let them stay small and merely guaranteed them where they stood. America chose the guarantee. And so, the fragmentation that had caused the catastrophe in the first place was not cured but preserved, embalmed, kept alive on federal support for decades longer than it ever would have lasted on its own. The country did not finally allow banks to branch freely across state lines until 1994, more than 60 years after the disease had first shown what it could do. Which is why the argument that began back in 1933 in that campaign letter and that grudging bargain was never truly settled. You watched it flare up again as recently as 2023, when Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in the span of a single day, the second largest bank failure in the nation's history up to that moment. Faster than a bank in the age of the smartphone was ever supposed to be able to fail, it proved that the run had not been abolished after all, only sedated, and that a modern panic could travel at the speed of a rumor on a screen. Nearly all of that bank's deposits sat above the insured limit, the figure that today stands at $250,000. By the strict letter of the law, everything above that line should have been lost. Instead, the regulators looked hard at the danger, decided the failure was too large to be allowed to spread, and guaranteed all of it, every last dollar, insured or not. That tells you what that limit truly is. It works less like a fixed wall protecting the small saver and no one beyond, and more like a promise that holds firmly for you and me right up until the moment the people in charge decide a particular failure is too dangerous to permit, at which point the limit becomes a polite fiction and the guarantee stretches to swallow whatever it must. The question underneath it is the same question Roosevelt and Glass were arguing over in 1933, and it has never once had a final answer. When a bank fails, who ultimately pays? The depositor, the industry, or the public? The sticker on the door tells you that you are safe, and you are. What it does not tell you is that the fight over who stands behind that promise and how much it might one day cost them is not history. It is not settled, it is ongoing, and it is still, quietly, being decided in